Ladies and gentlemen, I will address this session in English for the benefit of our English-speaking guests. My thanks to the Emirates Policy Center, Dr. Ibtisam Al-Kitbi, the esteemed government of the United Arab Emirates, and all delegates for your participation. I'm honored to be associated with four very distinguished speakers. We want to try and have a dynamic discussion. I appreciate it is after lunch, so your patience in staying awake with us, and we will try and make it as lively and lots of things to discuss, really. And without further ado, I'm going to just go to my left, and some real questions as you gentlemen will speak. I think we'll give 10 minutes for each speaker, so if you can try and stay within this time frame. And as we go to our first speaker, the immediate question that comes to mind is, our crude oil in the Middle East, is it still crude? Is it learning the manners of the market? Is it something that is upholding our strategic importance in the region? Does lower oil prices mean diminishing in importance for the Middle East as a center of energy? Will our importance continue to be significant? More specifically, the role of technology, I want our speakers to think about the role of the shale oil and the influence of the US shale oil revolution, and the market forces, the oil market forces. What is going to happen? How is the Gulf going to respond to these market forces? Japan, on the consumption side, is a very important entity. So what is the implication of the shift of Japan to nuclear energy? But immediately, I'd like you to welcome the first speaker. And here, my question for you, sir, is specifically related to the two things. Number one, the role of US shale oil. I would like you to incorporate this in your discussion. And number two is the competition of renewable energy and the future trajectory as it relates to the United Arab Emirates and the wider GCC region. So without further ado,
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I work for the International Monetary Fund, but I have to put the disclaimer at the beginning that I'm speaking on my own behalf and not in an official capacity here. But I will draw on some of the research that we do in the IMF on these sorts of issues. You know, we are clearly at an inflection point in the so-called commodity super cycle. With oil prices hitting a low and staying there for some period of time. Our analysis seems to suggest that this is about maybe half caused by supply factors and half caused by demand factors. The supply factors include the shale oil revolution, but I think they also include the increasing competition from renewable energy sources, which in some markets and with some tax incentives are now becoming extremely competitive with fossil fuel production. So, if we think about this going forward, the demand part of the low oil price may be something that the world economy will overcome relatively quickly in the next few years. But the supply side may be a more permanent feature. And I think our own view in the IMF is that oil prices are likely to remain below the $100 per barrel rate for some considerable time, for several years to come at the very least. And I think from a planning perspective, the impact on countries can be quite substantial in terms of the relative power. Now, on the issue of relative power, what I would say is that countries, oil exporting countries that prepared well during the good times are unlikely to see a considerable drop in their income and power in the world economy. And I think most of the GCC falls into that category of countries that have set aside considerable resources in sovereign wealth funds that then now can be drawn upon to continue investment programs, to continue education and social benefits for their citizens. Other countries that have not prepared in this way are going to be much more severely affected. If I were to just name a couple that come off the top of my head, Venezuela is already in a very severe crisis because they didn't save money in the good times, and now they're they're facing the bad times. We've talked a lot in this conference over the last day and a half about Iran. Interestingly enough, Iran is a country that's going to be more severely affected by low oil prices than the Gulf countries because they didn't have that buffer because of the sanctions, et cetera. So this is going to be one of the key dividing factors among the oil exporters. Who prepared in good times, who didn't prepare well in good times. The other thing that I would say about this is that as we look to the farther future, say a decade or 2 decades out, we should anticipate that fossil fuels will likely become a declining share of the world energy market because of increasing environmental consciousness, because of climate change initiatives, and because of the decreasing price due to technological innovation of renewables. So this is another thing that is necessary for planning in countries like the GCC. There's no reason why these countries can't also be at the forefront of renewable technology. You've got massive sun resources, for example. But this takes planning and investment, I think, and that's going to be an important point. I'll stop here for now.
That's great. Can you elaborate briefly on the issue of the shale oil revolution? Because I think particularly we want to know how it affects the foreign policy aspect and how it affects the rebalancing of economic alliances. Is it a real revolution? Is it sustainable in your view?
Well, I do think that it's a real revolution, and I do think that it's sustainable, but we have to be clear that this shale technology is a high-cost technology. And so when prices drop, shale becomes much less attractive. Also, we have to recognize that there are significant environmental concerns, and some parts of the world have voluntarily chosen not to pursue that path. So while shale technology is being heavily used in the United States and in Canada, it's not being adopted by and large in Europe. And so we're going to, we see different reactions to this kind of technology. So if it's a high-cost technology, when oil prices are low, we're going to see less investment in shale. Now, it is still possible that technological change will reduce those prices further going forward. But, for the Gulf region, which is a low-cost producer, you're sort of going to be the producers of last resort because the other ones are going to be priced out of the market. There's been some argument that this may be part of a strategy on the part of Saudi Arabia and others to pump up the volumes to get prices down and sort of price out the more expensive oil from the market. I have no idea about that. I'm not privy to any of that information. But I do think we will see that there will be a pause, if not a slight decline, in the contribution of shale oil. Now, turning to the question, which I think is an excellent one, about what does this mean for world power and strategic relations. My sense from a lot of the comment that we received over this first day and a half from Americans who think about these issues quite a lot is that this shouldn't have a radical change in terms of the United States' approach to the world. However, there is a tendency inside the U.S., a current of thought, that says now that we're more energy independent, we can care less about the Middle East. I think that's a misguided conception, but that trend does exist there. And there is an isolationist ideological trend in the U.S. that's always just under the surface. And that may come up closer to the surface if the U.S. perceives that it's going to be more energy independent for a longer period of time. But I think that's still a minority trend in the U.S.
Thank you very much. So, final question, quickly. Do you feel that it's too black and white to say that the shale oil revolution really basically means the U.S. is energy independent and it represents a fundamental shift in the balance of global power? And do you think there's a little bit more complication to it? It's more complicated than that. And as a quick follow-on, the Gulf has a shale oil potential also. The Gulf region has a big oil potential on shale and gas, which is not very often discussed. How feasible is it for the Gulf to develop its shale oil industry?
Yeah, great questions. I think in terms of the issue of fundamental change, my view would be the fundamental change is not so much in the relationship of the U.S. vis-a-vis the Middle East, but perhaps in the relationship of other great powers with each other. Let me explain. Among the countries more negatively affected by the recent decline in oil prices has certainly been Russia. The effect of the decline of oil prices has been much more significant to the Russian economy than the sanctions that Russia has been placed under from the interventions in Crimea and Ukraine. So this is an important factor as we look at the relative balance of power. People might think, well, Russia's becoming increasingly active, Syria, this involvement here. That's true, but I think the long-term economic trend is that Russia is going to be harder hit by a long period of low oil prices than many other countries. And it may be a bit of house of cards economically for Mr. Putin. He can carry on this interventionist policy for a period of time, but he may not have the economic wherewithal to keep it going for a more lengthy period.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Moving on to Marat, I think Jeffrey gave us a lot of food for thought. If we turn our attention for a second on this subject of technology and then come back with Mr. Mohammed to the issue of markets. But for the time being, I want you to think about technology, Marat, in your analysis. And specifically, what role does it play and how does it shift the balance of power in terms of the energy industry as a whole? And I guess the obstacle that some countries will experience in adopting technology, is it price? Is it politics? What do you think?
Thanks, Jaafar, and good afternoon, everybody. It's really great to be here back in Abu Dhabi. Thanks to the organizers for this really interesting event. Well, look, first of all, I think, when we talk about shifting power and shifting balances of power, we need to kind of identify what we mean. And I think people generally might be familiar with this discussion, but I mean, there's been a global shift, I would say, in power from west to east that we've seen since the early 2000s. And what do I mean by this? Well, I mean by capitalization, let's say, of the economies of certain countries in the East, broadly speaking, and the significance of these countries now that they play in the world economy. So the rise of countries like China, rise of regions like the GCC, significance of BRICS countries, underscored by sovereign wealth funds and the role of sovereign wealth funds as exporters of FDI, net capital, into the global economy. So all of these sort of factors underpin this discussion in shifting power and shifting sort of global balances. There's been some really good articles on, the sort of decline of the Seven Sisters, the sort of original, IOCs that were so dominant in the global oil economy, and the rise of the NOCs, national sort of oil companies. So I think this is, particularly when you talk about energy sector, one of the most kind of significant shifts that we've seen, in quite some time in recent history. And when you come to the question of what role has technology actually played in this shift in power, immediately one might think that, particularly in this part of the world, that access to technology in a historical context, access to industry, industrialization equates to power. Okay, so we think that technology basically equals increased power, and one could perhaps be misled into thinking that technology has played a pivotal role in this whole shifting power sort of thesis. But I would say, very much as an internationalist who travels a great deal, to many corners of the world, that technology has played a role, but it's been maybe a less leading role than market factors and also some political factors. So when I mean by market factors, I mean why has power shifted in this direction? It started shifting because around about 2002, 2003, around about the time of the American intervention in Iraq, we saw very significant start of incremental demand increasing in countries like China, growing economies in a lot of these countries, which has underpinned this, shift in power for me. So, I mean, this is something that people quite often overlook, but I think it's a very fundamental sort of point to make that really, well, Jeffrey partially mentioned some of these things, but it's really been these market forces that, for me, that have been drivers of these things. And, indeed, rising commodity prices, has led to a lot of energy security sort of tensions, dealing quite a lot with Russia. Jeffrey mentioned, Putin, how long can they sort of, how long do they have to sit out for a rainy day? Economic growth of Russia now is tempering, and this is kind of underpinning a reversal of this kind of shift in power, or a correction, let's say, in shifting power. But in terms of technology, we have the technology to do just about everything in the energy sector, be it lay, deep sea underwater pipelines, exploit, very complex hydrocarbon resources in the Arctic seas, and transport gas with LNG tankers, incredible sort of technology capacity. But whether it's technologies that determine, whether we actually build the pipelines or, exploit the hydrocarbons access, this actually is not necessarily the case. And just very briefly, people may have noticed that the Italian oil company Eni has just discovered a huge gas finding in the East Mediterranean off Egypt and Egyptian continental waters. So, this Zohr field, what is going to govern the development of this field? Is it going to be purely technology? Eni has the technology to actually develop, but it's going to be, the market factors, whether the gas goes, for domestic Egyptian consumption, whether it goes into regional, Mashrek, let's say, gas market, or whether it's going to be, utilized by Eni. These are the key questions for me that are driving the shifting power.
Excellent. Just briefly, I want to probe you on the issue of R&D, research and development. Usually R&D, it's Europe, United States, the West is usually known for its R&D expenditure. Research and development in the Gulf, how do you feel about the research and developments in the Gulf? Do you think that the Gulf is more of a contributor to global research and development, or do you think there is a scope for more contribution that could come from the Gulf in terms of R&D specifically?
Well, it's kind of a growth curve, I would say to you. The fact that we're here in this wonderful venue, and that there's so much, being invested into this kind of, brainstorming session to discuss about strategic issues. It's a factor showing that, there is great interest in R&D. This is all about brain power, about, research, people's ability to contribute to scientific, let's say, discussions, and of course, technologies in that respect. But I mean, while we have seen in more recent years very significant, let's say, probing on the fringes of cutting-edge technologies, let's say, in renewable energy sector in the Gulf. I mean, this is, after all, Abu Dhabi. We're more or less home to the Mazda project. We're home to IRENA here. So, we do want to utilize, let's say, some of these solar energies, renewable energies to maximum effect. And in fact, question of economic diversification is a hugely strategic one, which we can also explore if you like. But these are all relatively recent advents. In my country, Australia, in the US, where I lived and studied, UK, it's an industry. I mean, we have R&D as an industry. Very strong links, as people know. I don't need to elaborate on this, between industry, academia, scientific sort of institutions. Here we are, we're kind of in a phase of post-modernity, because we're not just reliant on industrialization and oil industrialization. Indeed, we're well-known. Countries like Bahrain, first to discover oil, have run out of oil, so they've diversified, and they've done incredibly well in the aluminium sector. We all know Aluminium Bahrain as an enterprise. So we have seen very positive precedents in that respect. We have seen very positive, I mean, if you talk about technology more broadly, the revolution of Qatar, let's say, economy and society from the 1980s through current times, through the LNG industry. And that, of course, had its share of R&D and, technological sort of development in energy. So we have had precedent, but we still haven't institutionalized it in the way that we do in the West, in terms of the, all the linkages between industry and, the R&D sector. So I think, we're moving in a positive direction. There's been very positive precedent, but, it's still very much a learning curve.
Thank you very much, Marat. Moving on, Mr. Mohammed, how are you?
Fine, how are you?
Fine, thank you. So, I think what we've heard from our previous two speakers is very much about market forces is coming out as a theme. We talked about technology. Technology is very important. I want to put two suggestions to you. The first suggestion is the rumors that in 5 years' time, Saudi Arabia will be bankrupt and the Gulf will be bankrupt. I hope not, because I have to leave. That means I have to go somewhere else. But this is the first rumor that we're hearing. The second scenario, if I take Russia, Iran, Iraq, put together, this is almost double the output of Saudi Arabia. If these three have a strategic alliance, this is one example of how market forces can shape the future of the industry. But what I want to know from you, how is the market going to evolve? What are the market forces, and specifically in the oil markets? Thank you.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. في البداية أود أن أشكر الأخت ابتسام على الدعوة وأحيي الجميع على حضورهم. في البداية أود أن أذكر أن ما سألته الخاص بإفلاس المملكة العربية السعودية خلال 5 سنوات هو صادر من الأخ الذي بجانبك، وهو صندوق النقد الدولي. وصندوق النقد الدولي ذكر هذا في بعض تقاريره السابقة، وهذا طبعا غير صحيح، لأنه المملكة العربية السعودية تتمتع باحتياطي مالي قوي، وأيضا لديها الدين العام متدني جدا، وبالتالي لديها الفرصة إما أن تزيد الدين العام أو تسحب من الاحتياطي في الفترة القادمة، بالإضافة حتما إلى ترشيدها للإنفاق، والذي بدأت به حكومة المملكة العربية السعودية. وبالتالي مسألة الإفلاس قد تكون أماني لدى البعض، ولكنها لن تتحقق بإذن الله. الموضوع النفط الصخري هذا كثيرون يعتقدون أنه هو السبب فيما حدث في أسواق النفط. هو صحيح عامل بارز في أسواق النفط. كلنا يعرف أن الولايات المتحدة خلال الفترة التي ارتفعت فيها الأسعار أعلى من $100 ول4 سنوات متواصلة قد سمحت لتقنية مثل تقنية النفط الصخري أن تستخدم بشكل كبير في الولايات المتحدة ليزيد إنتاج الولايات المتحدة بمقدار 5 مليون برميل يومياً، ويصل الآن في حدود 9 مليون إنتاج الولايات المتحدة، 9 مليون و3 أو 300 ألف برميل يومياً، وهذه هي أكبر كمية إنتاج للولايات المتحدة منذ السبعينات. فحتماً التقنية هذه مهمة ومهمة جداً، لكن البعض اعتقد أنه بانخفاض الأسعار عن $80 ستنتهي هذه التقنية وينخفض الإنتاج بشكل كبير، ورأينا أن الأسعار انخفضت من 80 60 50 وحتى وصلت الأربعينات، ولم يتأثر بشكل كبير الإنتاج من النفط الصخري. والسبب الرئيسي أن هذه الصناعة تعلمت خلال العام الماضي منذ أن بدأت الأسعار في الانخفاض أن تزيد من كفاءتها الإنتاجية، وبالتالي حققت وفرة كبيرة في التكاليف، وأيضاً ساعدها التطور التقني في تخفيض التكاليف. الآن هنالك حديث بأن الفجوة بين النفط الصخري أو دعونا نقول النفط غير التقليدي والنفط التقليدي، الفجوة التكلفة ستتضاءل عبر السنوات القادمة بفعل التقدم التقني، وبالتالي لا يمكن الحكم بأنه المملكة العربية السعودية هي بتدافع عن حصتها من أجل إخراج الصخري. أنا دائما أردد هذه أن الصخري وجد ليبقى وسيبقى معنا، وعلى الدول المنتجة وغير المنتجة أن تتكيف بوجوده. صحيح سيكون هنالك صعود وهبوط في إنتاجه نتيجة للأسعار، ولذلك سموه النيو سوينج بروديوسر، المنتج المرن الجديد، وهذا الدور قد يؤدي إلى فعلا أن تمارسوا صناعة النفط الصخري ما لم تنخفض التكلفة بشكل كبير، وأنا أتوقع أن تكلفتها تنخفض بشكل كبير، وسيتم تعميم التقنية لبقية الدول التي تمتلك احتياطات كبيرة من النفط الصخري والغاز الصخري، مثل الصين، الأرجنتين، روسيا، وحتى المملكة العربية السعودية. نحن الآن بدأنا في المملكة العربية السعودية نستكشف الغاز الصخري في مناطق الشمال لنستفيد لتغطي جزء من الاحتياجات المحلية في المملكة العربية السعودية. لكن القول بأن النفط الصخري هو كل ما سبب أزمة انخفاض أسعار النفط هذا غير صحيح. هنالك عوامل أثرت في الطلب خلال السنوات الخمس أو الست الماضية فأدت إلى ما يسمى بهدم الطلب، demand destruction. والسبب أن العالم بدأ يتأقلم مع طلب أقل من النفط مقابل كل سعر من الأسعار، ناهيك عن أن هنالك الكثير من السياسات التي تم اتخاذها في الماضي منذ السبعينات، منذ الحظر البترولي الأول أو الوحيد طبعاً، حظر البترول العربي الذي كان في 73 والدول الصناعية على رأسها، بدأت تتبنى سياسات لتخفيض اعتمادها على النفط، وهي قد حققت جزء كبير من هذا من خلال ترشيد الاستهلاك، زيادة الكفاءة، تحول إلى البدائل. الآن بدأت الدول الصناعية تنقل هذه السياسات إلى بقية دول العالم، وكما ذكر زميلي أنه من خلال سياسات تغير المناخ، وهي كما ذكر الرئيس بوتين قبل يومين، قال أن هذه لعبة غربية يراد بها حصر النمو الصناعي والاقتصادي للدول الصاعدة والدول النامية. إذن هذه السياسات ستؤدي، الصين سوف لن تطلب نفس الكميات التي كانت تطلبها بالسابق، وهو من مصلحتها أن تتجه لتكون أكثر كفاءة، لتتنوع في مصادر الطاقة المختلفة. الآن النقل العام في كل الدول تقريباً بيستخدم مصادر غير المصادر البترولية، من كهرباء، من غاز إلى آخره. فكل هذه الأمور بدأت تغير، هنالك ثورة في الطاقة، هنالك اتجاه نحو الطاقة الخضراء، هنالك تحول. الآن المرونة السعرية للطلب العالمي على النفط منخفضة جداً، بحيث أنه نرى أن أسعار النفط انخفضت خلال العام الماضي بأكمله، ولم يتأثر الطلب بارتفاع كبير. هنالك ارتفاع ضئيل جدا، صحيح جزء منه أن الصين تأثرت اقتصاديا، أن النمو الاقتصادي العالمي قد تباطأ إلى آخره، لكن أيضا هنالك سبب رئيسي وهيكلي، وهو أن الطلب لم يعد يستجيب كما كان يستجيب في الماضي لانخفاض الأسعار. إذن هنالك تغيرات كبيرة في أسواق النفط علينا أن نعيها، وقد تأخذ كما ذكر زميلي قد تأخذ سنوات. الناس الأخوان الذين يعتقدون أننا العام القادم سنصل إلى مستوى $100 هذول لم يدرسوا السوق بالكامل، ولذا وقد يكون هذا مجال سؤال آخر، لذا على دول الخليج أن تتحسب للفترة القادمة بتنويع اقتصادها بالصورة المطلوبة.
شكرا جزيلا أستاذ محمد. Well, we can continue this for hours. I can certainly. Fantastic, inspiring discussion. Japan. So I think for us it's a very significant market. Certainly on the consumer side, Japan has shifted to nuclear energy. Does this reflect a concern about the Middle East? Is Japan concerned about energy security? Does this explain why the shift has happened to the nuclear side? And what is Japan's future vision or role on the Gulf specifically and on the energy security between Japan and the Middle East? Please, Itoh-san, thank you.
First of all, it is such a great privilege to be here with distinguished colleagues and guests. Thank you very much for the Emirates Business Center and the Atlantic Council. I'm really enjoying this conference. This is just excellent. Well, as you know, we had such a big tragedy of a nuclear disaster back in March 2011. Well, for the past 4 years and plus, domestically, we had a very harsh debate and controversy about the future scale of nuclear restart. But finally, actually, Japan has not yet drastically changed its nuclear policy as a whole. Well, of course, we have to introduce more strict safety regulation, and we need to be more careful about everything, because up until that day of the natural disaster, no one would have ever expected the scale of nuclear accidents. And people are still allergic about anything nuclear. This is a fact. But considering the robust physical fact of Japanese geographical location and constraints, there will be no way back for Japan not to restart nuclear reactors. As many of you know, Japan is in short of natural resources. We are completely dependent upon import for oil and LNG supplies. Well, according to the latest future plan of our Japanese energy mix, well, nuclear power is still projected to account for more than 20% of the total power mix as late as 2030. Well, this is quite natural, I think, but Japan's self-sufficiency of energy is as low as 5 to 6% without restarting nuclear reactors. This is extremely low by international standards. Well, Japan's commitment to the 3-year use of nuclear energy is quite significant internationally as well for 3 reasons. First, if Japan does not restart nuclear reactors in a considerable scale, what's going to happen to the global hydrocarbon markets? It might trigger a competition over oil and gas supplies. Well, that may please some producing nations. That's if you know what is happening regionally in East Asia, Northeast Asia, or you could include the domain of South China Sea over there. Well, Chinese energy demand is increasing. Korea is also one of the biggest oil and gas consumers, etc., etc., etc. If Japan does not restart nuclear reactors, regional competition over hydrocarbons are bound to be intensified. In other words, by way of restarting nuclear reactors, Japan can reduce its potential demand of oil and gas. And in so doing, it is also important not to drain national wealth. For the past about 4 years after the Fukushima disaster, well, due to the drastically increased volume of LNG imports, Japan suffered from huge budget deficits. Practically, this is not sustainable. Well, second, actually, nuclear market is projected to expand since increasing number of developing economies will introduce nuclear reactors in the forthcoming decades. Well, then it is actually Japan's responsibility to share its rich experiences in the safety countermeasures, which are actually reinforced by the Fukushima tragedy, must be shared globally. And lastly, Japan, together with the United States, has been a leading advocate of civilian or peaceful use of nuclear over the decades, where, in other words, Japan's commitment to reinforcement of the non-proliferation regime and nuclear safety must be such an irreversible moral responsibility. In this regard, again, there should be no way back.
Thank you very much, Itoh-san. I hope we'll discuss Japan more in the question and answer session. And before I go there, quickly, I want to go back to something that Mr. Mohammed said about the IMF. And since we have the IMF with us, we would like a comment from the IMF on the prediction of Saudi's future demise.
Yeah, I think that we're not predicting the bankruptcy of Saudi Arabia, but what we have indicated in our latest regional economic outlook is that if you look at many of the oil-producing states in the Middle East, over the last years, what you see is that the so-called budget break-even oil price has been rising significantly. So what that means is that a higher oil price is needed to sustain the budget policies of these countries. Now we are in a position where the actual price is well below the break-even price for most countries. The countries have accumulated reserves in sovereign wealth funds, in their central banks, etc. And rightly, they are using those reserves now to tide them through this time of low prices. However, in some cases, and I think Saudi is one that we have to discuss, the size of the budget deficit that has been generated by the drop in oil prices is really very large, something on the order of 15 to 18% of GDP. And it may be necessary, even in countries that have set aside resources for this rainy day, that they need to adjust their spending policies to make it more sustainable over a longer period of time. Now, if you expect oil prices are low only for a year or two, then you don't see any reason to adjust because you'll be recovering that money later on. But if, as I and I think my colleagues in the IMF believe, you're likely to have a sustained period of 5 to 10 years of low oil prices, then in some countries, adjustment may well be necessary. So I think it's not bankruptcy we're talking about, it's whether the spending policies are sustainable and how to make them more sustainable.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. So we have about 20 odd minutes or so for questions. I encourage you to keep your questions as
Just a comment on
brief.
the
Sorry,
issue.
Mr. Mohammed, you have a follow-up. Please, we have to make it as quick as possible.
Yeah.
Thank you.
With regard to the issue of whether the energy independence of the United States will allow it to not to defend the region, I don't think so. First of all, energy independence of the United States will take a very long time. It is not coming very soon as been expected. Secondly, even if the United States import 1 barrel from other countries other than the GCC, then they need the region for stability of the prices. Thirdly, which is very important, even if they achieved independence, then oil will continue to play an important role in the economic relationship among countries. So they need the United States to influence also how to play with these relationships in order to achieve the maximum benefit for not only for the United States, but also for the different stakeholders.
Thank you very much again. So we move and we open the floor to questions, and I have the first one from Ms. Dania Khaliyat.
سؤالي للسيد طائي وللسيد محمد الصبان بالنسبة للأهمية الاستراتيجية للنفط. حضرتك سيد طائي سألت ما هي الانعكاسات على سياسة أمريكا الخارجية مع المنطقة. سؤالي للسيد محمد الصبان، شو الانعكاسات لسياسة الخليج مع أمريكا لما النفط سيفقد أهميته الاستراتيجية؟ ما هي البدائل حتى نستقطب أمريكا حتى تضل أمريكا حليف للخليج؟
شكرا جزيلا. سأوجه السؤال في العربي. لا أعتقد أنه تهبط أهمية المنطقة كما قال الأستاذ محمد. لا أعتقد أنه تهبط أهمية المنطقة استراتيجيا سواء إذا كان التجربة الصخرية في الولايات المتحدة ناجحة لو غير ناجحة، تبقى المنطقة مهمة لعدة أسباب جيوبوليتيكية وأسباب اقتصادية. فبالنسبة لقضية البدائل وموضوع البدائل، لا أعتقد أنه راح يصير بديل للموارد الطبيعية اللي قد تتطور في المنطقة حالياً. وأعتقد أنه تبقى المنطقة مصدر مهم اقتصادي وجيوبوليتيكي. أستاذ محمد.
شكرا أختي على السؤال. أنا أعتقد أنه طالما المملكة ودول الخليج استمرت كلاعب رئيسي في سوق النفط العالمي، فإن علاقتها مع مختلف الشركاء لن تتأثر. الآن نرى، وكما ذكر السيشن قبل هذا الخاص بالريستراكشرينج الورلد ايكونوميك اوردر، نرى أن الأسواق قد فتحت، وأحجام الأسواق في الصين وفي الشرق هي كبيرة جدا، وهنالك اتجاه لتنويع أماكن التصدير بالنسبة للمصادر الرئيسية ألا وهي البترول. وبالتالي التنويع هذا مهم لئلا تعتمد على منطقة دون أخرى في توفير أو في تسويق منتجاتنا البترولية. فأنا لا أتصور أنه في المدى المتوسط وحتى الطويل أن تتأثر علاقة مع الولايات المتحدة أو مع أي دولة أخرى نتيجة لانخفاض أهمية النفط. اليوم سمعنا أو أمس سمعنا المندوب الأستاذ الجامعي الصيني يذكر أننا نتهافت مع بقية الدول لنذهب إلى إيران لنستكشف مزيد من البترول، مدركين أهمية البترول في سواء إيران أو غير إيران. وبالتالي بما أن إيران هي أيضا لها احتياطات كبيرة، نجد أن هنالك طلب أو هنالك إقبال من الشركات عليها. إذن الأهمية ليست مرتبطة بالتأثرات أو التقلبات التي تحدث في أسواق النفط بين الحين والآخر.
وأود أضيف نقطة باختصار. تكلفة الإنتاج في منطقتنا عن مقياس دولي وعالمي يعني منافسة لأي سوق عالمي، فهذا بحد ذاته هذا السبب يبرر استمرار أهمية الموارد الطبيعية النفطية. شكرا. تفضل.
الخاصة بنقل التقنية من الدول المتقدمة إلى الدول النامية، هذه مسألة قديمة جديدة. وأذكر أنا منذ شاركت في مؤتمر ريو في عام 1992 في مؤتمر قمة التنمية المستدامة، وكانت هذه أحد المشاكل العويصة المطروحة وأحد مشاكل أو أحد نقاط الخلاف بين الدول النامية والدول الصناعية. الدول الصناعية لم تكن ترغب في نقل التقنية إلا عند مستوى تكلفتها المرتفعة، وأيضا بتخير وسلكتيفيتي محددة. والدول النامية تود أن تستفيد من التقنية. الآن حينما ظهر موضوع الرينيوبلز، وبما أنه يخدم لتحقيق استقلالية عن استيراد النفط، نجد أن هنالك ليس فقط تقنية تقدم، إنما تقدم وبأسعار كونسيشنال، بأسعار مخفضة لتحريك هذا المجال. وأيضا نتيجة لسيطرة الدول الغربية على مؤسسات مالية مثل البنك الدولي وصندوق النقد الدولي، نجد أنهم يقدمون الأموال الطائلة لمختلف الدول النامية من أجل إقامة مشاريع في مصادر الطاقة الأخرى، ويتمنعون من تقديمها للفوسل فيول بحجة حماية المناخ. بطبيعة الحال على رأس هذه هو النفط، لأن النفط هو الآن هو المخيف بالنسبة لكثير من الدول. هنالك ضرائب مرتفعة جدا مفروضة على النفط الدول الصناعية في معظم دول الOECD countries. هنالك لا زالت، لو أخذنا مسمى أو حماية المناخ، لا زالت هنالك دول تقدم إعانات للفحم، بينما الفحم يبعث غازات الكربون أكثر مما يبعثه البترول. إذن هنالك تحيز وليست هنالك مساواة. وأيضا حتى في صناعة النفط التقليدي والنفط الصخري هنالك الآن الولايات المتحدة المملكة المتحدة بتقدم تاكس ما يسمى بالتاكس انسنتيفز، إعفاءات ضريبية لمنتجي النفط من بحر الشمال نتيجة لارتفاع تكلفة هؤلاء. إذن وأيضا هنالك حوافز ضريبية لمنتجي الرينيوبلز المصادر المتجددة، هنالك حوافز ضريبية لإنتاج الطاقة النووية. فإذا النفط somehow محاصر، وكما ذكر زميلنا من صندوق النقد الدولي أن تدريجيا يتوقع أنه الوقود الأحفوري تتناقص مساهمته في ميزان الطاقة العالمي، وهذه إذا كان التناقص طبيعي فأهلا وسهلا، لكن إذا كان التناقص مصطنع كما نرى فهذه تؤثر حتما على استمرارية تنمية الدول النامية ومنها الدول المنتجة للنفط.
شكرا أستاذ محمد. So we have a question from the floor from Mr. Michael Brown, please.
Thank you. We heard about the energy picture in Japan, which was fascinating and important. I would like to ask any of the panelists to talk about two other important countries, China and India. What are the prospects in these countries for energy production and energy consumption? And looking specifically at the Persian Gulf, what are the prospects for China and India playing a more direct role in the decades ahead, militarily, in protecting their access to energy supplies from the Persian Gulf? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent question. I'm going to turn to Jeffrey for the first comment.
Okay. I'm not an expert in energy production in China or India, but I'll give you some thoughts on this. I mean, certainly playing on the discussion that we just had with Mr. Sabban about the policies for energy going forward. China has relied very heavily on coal for energy production up until now. I think we're going to see that starting to change. Coal production is dying out in much of the Western world because natural gas is a environmentally better and also now economically competitive option. I think that's going to be the direction that China is going to follow as well. As Chinese consumers become wealthier, they become more and more concerned about consuming a clean environment, not just consuming basic needs goods. And as they want a cleaner environment, they're going to look for cleaner fuel sources to provide that. I think we're on a chain of production here where the dirtiest fuel is perhaps coal, and then we can move up to oil and gas, and then there's this pressure to move beyond oil and gas to renewables. I don't think that's going to be changing anytime soon. Now, India is somewhat behind China in the development process. And therefore, we may see continued use of cheaper fuels like coal, even though they have negative environmental effects. But I want to make one final point about this, and that is in China, in India, everywhere in the world, the energy intensity of economic activity is declining over time. The world is producing more GDP for a given unit of energy than it did in the past. And that's going to continue to be the case in the future.
Thank you very much. Brief comments from me on China and India. I think China has a different role of geopolitics than the United States, and I don't envisage China as being directly militarily present as a result of the increased energy security. Similarly, India is building a blue water navy, but again, I don't see the same type of paradigm as that the US has put forward in terms of strategic security in the region. We have a question from Mr. Hamid.
Can I add something on this?
Sorry, yes, please.
With regard to the relationship between GCC and China, I think this is a period where it is flourishing. Now we see that we have joint ventures, refineries, joint ventures. We have petrochemical joint ventures with China. We have huge cooperation with China. Actually, China just last week signed an agreement that they will support technological development with regard to refined products in order to intensify the productivity or the capacity of refined products in Saudi Arabia, and of course the market for that will be the Chinese market. So we have looked at we have looked at China a long time ago. It is not something new. Since 2000, late King Abdullah visited China, and then the cooperation started at that time, and I think we are proceeding accordingly, and I think the relationship between the two will intensify, will be much stronger in the coming years.
Well, that was a very important question on China and India, and I want to, the panelists, both, Marat, please, you have a comment about this.
Just briefly, and I think people may generally omit this sort of point, but China is becoming very active in the process of the Energy Charter Treaty, and I don't know how well people know the Energy Charter Treaty, but it's the world's only sectoral treaty for investment protection in the energy sector. It's kind of like a WTO for the energy sector, but specifically on investment protection, as well as trade and transit. And China is an observer, and at our ministerial conference in The Hague in the Netherlands this May, where we had 75 countries adopt the new International Energy Declaration, China had by far the biggest delegation out of these 75 countries that actually attended. The delegation was led by the Energy Minister of China. And key issue here for China, why is it coming into the process, is the issue of governance, energy governance, particularly at the global level. So China is increasingly interested in, voicing its position on global energy governance, on the type of rules and principles that underlie energy cooperation between nation states. So we all know that energy security is a huge issue for China. We all know that China has substantial interest in, and has been acquiring upstream assets, in global jurisdictions. It has, of course, significant shale reserves, which it may choose to develop at some point. But the interesting thing from our perspective is that in terms of global governance benchmarks, just during the last 2 to 3 years, China has become very active in the charter process, and I would not exclude, although I don't predict, but I would not exclude that it does become a contracting party to the Energy Charter Treaty in the future.
We have just over 5 minutes. Itoh-san, can we have a comment from you on this issue as brief as possible? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, some people are concerned about the impact of U.S. rebalancing to Asia. Some people say that it may reduce U.S. presence in the Middle East, which I doubt. Well, I think the rising importance of China factor is giving you a new opportunity to work together in a constructive way. Well, thanks to the shared relation, the U.S. will reduce the amount of oil import from this region, but the increasing amount of oil will be exported from the Middle East to Asia. Then the question is, who will guarantee the safety of the sea lane of communication, stretching from the Gulf area, cutting through the Manaarco Strait, all the way through the South China Sea to East Asia? Well, I think U.S. rebalancing to Asia is more than welcome for the Middle Eastern nations as well to secure the safety of export supplies. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I have
30 seconds if you can.
Oh, 30 seconds. I think there was a point mentioned by our colleague from the IMF with regard to the role of OPEC. I think OPEC now is doing the right thing. They cannot alone defend the market as they used to. In the past, of course, their market share was much higher. Now it is only 32%. And unless OPEC is joined by Russia and other major producers, OPEC will not do it. And this has been very blunt, very well known. And I don't think, even though we had a meeting just 2 weeks ago, but the meeting was resulted in nothing because Russia and others are reluctant to engage in production cut. And probably they want also to defend their market share. But this will have repercussion because next year, when Iran comes with additional oil, and also Iraq and other countries, then the surplus, the oil surplus will be huge, and that will impact prices negatively.
Thank you very much. So we have a question from the floor. Mr. Hamid Al-Ahbabi, please. Thank you.
عفوا السلام عليكم. هو سؤال مني أنا فاروق الحمودي بخصوص أسعار النفط. كما استمعت لمعظم الاقتصاديين أن لأول مرة في تاريخ أسعار النفط بهذه المدة ينخفض أسعار النفط. سؤالي هو للضيوف، ما مدى انعكاس انخفاض أسعار النفط على الاقتصاد الخليجي والدول المنتجة بشكل عام؟ وهل هناك فترة أو رؤية معينة لأسعار النفط مثلا سنة سنتين، وما انعكاس ذلك على الاقتصاد الخليجي، خصوصا وأن دول الخليج تخوض لديها إنفاق في دول تحالف حرب في اليمن؟ ما هي رؤيتكم في هذا الموضوع؟
أستاذ محمد.
صحيح أسعار النفط قد تستمر لفترة أطول مما كان يتصور، لأنه الآن سوق النفط قد دخل دورة اقتصادية جديدة تتسم بالركود في سوق النفط، تتسم بوجود فائض في الأسواق. العرض لا يتلائم أو لا يتماشى مع الطلب العالمي على النفط، وبالتالي الأسعار ستستمر عند مستوياتها $50 $55 للأعوام القادمة. ولذلك على دول الخليج، دول مجلس التعاون، أن تتأقلم. هنالك اختلافات طبعا في درجة التحمل كما ذكر، ليس فقط في إطار منظمة الأوبك، وإنما أيضا في إطار دول مجلس التعاون. هنالك دول ستكون أكثر تحمل، يعني مثلا الأمارات هي أكثر تنوع، لديها صندوق سيادي، عدد سكانها أقل إلى آخره. ولذلك البريك ايفن بوينت بالنسبة للميزانية سواء الأمارات أو قطر هي حتما أقل بكثير بالنسبة لسعر النفط مقارنة بالمملكة العربية السعودية أو حتى دول زي البحرين وعمان. لكن في كل الأحوال على دولنا أن تتأقلم مع الوضع الجديد وتخطط للأسوأ حتى لو توقعت الأفضل، لأن هذا هو المخرج لنا في الفترة القادمة. لا يمكن أن نستمر business as usual. والواقع الآن بدأت دول الخليج تتخذ من الإجراءات في ترشيد الإنفاق، في البحث عن إيرادات إضافية عن طريق فرض ضريبة القيمة المضافة، عن طريق الرفع تدريجي للدعم عن الوقود، عن التخصيص. هنالك مرافق عديدة تمتلكها حكومات دول مجلس التعاون مؤهلة لأن يتم تخصيصها. من جهة ستزيد كفاءتها الإدارية، ومن جهة أخرى ستدر عائد للحكومات الخليجية. أنا أعتقد أن الفرصة هذه ممتازة بالرغم من صعوبة الامتحان الذي نواجهه، لكنه حتما سيدفعنا نحو ترشيد الإنفاق، نحو تخصيص أمثل لمواردنا، وإن شاء الله بإذن الله نكون أكثر مناعة ونبحر بسلام إلى بر الأمان.
شكرا جزيلا أستاذ محمد. So we have to unfortunately bring this fascinating discussion to a close. And to really sum up what we've discussed, we feel that market forces are much more important than we have been led to believe. Technology is also important, but we cannot ignore the overriding importance of market forces. Japan is a key energy consumer, and there is a consensus among our panel and maybe among our audience that the Gulf will continue to be an important energy resource and a source of energy, and increasing an important economic and geopolitical power. And with that in mind, please join me in thanking our esteemed panel, and thank you very much for your attention.